agricultural, economics, and extension specialist in state and local government, and he's been at Purdue for 34 years. So he is an expert.
Thank you.
On most everything.
Everything, that's right. Anything you want to know.
Especially on property tax. So tonight we're here to hear about the tax caps, the farm ground assessments, and making it all work together. And there were a couple of farmers who stopped and wanted to know if they could count on it. Evidently they did. Of course, Jason is a farmer, but I mean, otherwise. And I don't see them here, so maybe the RMC or the Farm View drew them to their location. So with that, we'll welcome, and we're going to learn something. We know.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ann. I'm pleased to be with you here today in fabulous Florida, as I saw the sign coming in, so let's do that. Let's see, just by way of introduction, because I know everybody's been thinking about Purdue over the weekend, and this basketball tournament that's going on, and they fortunately did make it into the Sweet 16 after much anxiety and everything. So what this means is that we can't have another weekend of anxiety coming up here this next weekend, and win or lose, that'll be true. And you know, one of the things I always think about this tournament is that we take the 64 best college teams in the country, and we make 63 of them wind up their season with a devastating loss. This is not a recipe for human happiness, you know? And so come next weekend, we'll be experiencing more misery and more stress, win or lose. And with that, speaking of misery and stress, let's talk about property taxes. All right. Well, farmland assessments, property taxes, Carroll County, Indiana. Let's start out by talking about farmland assessments, what has happened with farmland assessments, what's going to happen with farmland assessments, and why it is we can make very confident predictions about what's going to happen to the assessed value of farmland. Then we'll talk about how important farmland is in Carroll County, and then I've got some estimates, some actual numbers to present to you to sort of guesses, or I hope pretty good estimates, on which units of government are likely to be most affected, and what happens to taxpayers as this process of change in farmland assessment goes forward. First of all, the way we assess farmland is called use value assessment of farmland, and what that means is that farm ground is assessed the same way all across Indiana, no matter where it is. So an acre in Carroll County is assessed the same way as an acre in Tippecanoe County, and it would be assessed the same way if there was an acre of farm ground in the middle of downtown Indianapolis. It would be assessed in the same way, even though in terms of market value, the possible selling price of this ground, it may be very different. An acre in the middle of Indianapolis is certainly worth more than an acre in Warren County, for example, and yet we would assess them the same way. And the reason we do that, and the reason almost every state does that, is because we don't want farmers to have to sell their property because they can't meet their property taxes by growing corn or growing soybeans and selling the commodities. If you value the property and the property happens to be right next to a new residential neighborhood or right next to a commercial development or even in the middle of a commercial development, of course in terms of its market value it's worth more, and it might be worth so much in fact that you could not pay the property taxes by farming it. And so we use use value assessment for that reason. The assessment standard is objective measures of property wealth. That comes out of the Supreme Court decision from 1998. And so what we try to do when we come up with a formula for assessment of farmland, because if it isn't going to be based on selling prices, then we need a formula in which to set the assessed value of farmland. So we use objective data out there, and we run it through a formula. And I'll show you the formula here in a little bit. But the first thing we do is calculate the base rate per acre of farmland. And that's calculated each year by the Department of Local Government Finance, which is, as you know, the oversight agency of property taxes and local government in the state of Indiana. And they use data on rents and yields and commodity prices and costs and interest rates to make this calculation. And so it's a single number, it's a 4-digit number, and it's the starting point for the assessed value of every acre of farmland in Indiana. And that's the starting point. Now, the next thing you do is you take the soil productivity factor, which is measured based on an index developed by the Purdue Agronomy Department years ago, and measures the fertility of the soil in growing corn. And so they've got all these maps of soil types for the whole state. And that is a factor, and the factor ranges from 0.5 to 1.29, I think it is. And then multiply that factor by the base rate. That means that more productive land is valued higher and less productive land is valued lower. And then for some acreage, you subtract off an influence factor, and that's a percentage reduction for some acreage that might flood frequently, or might have a steep grade, or might be covered with trees or something like that. Anything that would reduce the productivity of the land for growing corn or beans, despite what its soil type might be. So what's been happening? Well, I put the base rate in red. What's been happening is the base rate had been increasing. Now the base rate is going to be decreasing. And it's the change in the base rate that have created the big changes in the assessed value of farmland. How big the changes? Well, changes in farmland assessment. Here's a chart. This is for the Indiana as a whole, and it takes a look at 4 different categories of property for the property tax. Homesteads, which are owner-occupied primary residences. Other residential, which is mostly rental housing, but includes second homes and vacation homes. Ag business and land, so that's agricultural land and buildings and equipment. And then business, real and personal property as business, buildings, land, and equipment. And we've got 3 bars for each one. The top one is the gross assessed value. That's the initial assessed value that the assessor puts on the property. Then the net assessed value, or taxable assessed value, and that's the gross minus deductions. And then the net tax after credits, so that's the tax that people, taxpayers actually pay. And we've got the data here. We've got bar charts that show the percentage changes in these 3 measures for these 4 kinds of property plus the total for 2007 through 2017. And so that's the last 10 years. We start in 2007 because that was the last year before the big property tax reform that passed during the Daniels administration. Governor Daniels, everybody remember Governor Daniels? Whatever happened to that guy anyway? It's like he dropped off the face of the earth. What, they thought he might be president of the United States, and then just disappeared. Anyhow, so we start out with what's been happening over the last 10 years. Well, the top property tax reform from 2008, 2009 was really focused on reducing property taxes for homeowners. Even though gross assessed value of homes has increased by 9.6%, the net assessed value after deductions has declined by 28%, and that's because of the big increase in the deductions that we apply to homes, and that has led to a 23% reduction in property taxes for homesteads. Other residential rental housing has seen a bigger increase. Remember, this is over 10 years, so it's about 3.5%, 3% per year, and they've seen property tax increases. But you know, property taxes have not increased nearly as much as the assessed value, and that's because they've been big beneficiaries of the constitutional tax caps. Rental housing is the biggest beneficiary of the property tax cap. We go up to business here, and 14.9% increase in net assessed value over 10 years. 1%, 1.5%, something like that per year, basically held harmless, and that was the idea. And then in total, as you can see, the property tax up 1.5% over 10 years. Now that's not per year, that's in total. Remember, we've had about 20% inflation over that period of time, so a 1.5% increase in property taxes is a pretty small number. Then comes agriculture, and agriculture over the last 10 years has seen a 77% increase in the gross assessed value of their property, mainly because of the increase in the base rate of farmland, and a almost 66% increase in property taxes statewide. And so agriculture looked at the tax reform and said, you know what, that just didn't do very much for us. If you take a look at Carroll County, here's Carroll County's numbers, and you know, I could stand here and try to explain why each bar looks the way it is, but let's focus on the point to be made here, and that's ag business and land. 81% increase in gross assessed value, 81% increase in net assessed value, 35% increase in property taxes, whereas homesteads are down, other residential up 15, business is down 6.3% decline in total. So again, farm property taxes, agricultural property taxes up considerably more than any other category of property. Well, what's the reason for that? It's because the formula that we were using was reflecting what was actually going on with the value of property. Corn prices were rising from 2007 to 2014. Corn prices went up, soybean prices went up, interest rates went down, and those three things combined made the base rate of farmland go up. Again, I'll show you the formula here in a minute. It was $880 per acre in 2007. By 2014, it was up to $1,760. It exactly doubled over 2 years. By 2016, the Department of Local Government Finance had calculated $2,420 as the base rate of farmland. And for various reasons, we were able to confidently predict that it was going to top 3,000 by 2018. By this year, it would have gone up to 3,000. Then remained in the 3,000 area for a couple of years before finally starting to drop in 2021, 2022, and 2023. And it was this that caught the attention of the legislature, especially because in 2014, commodity prices started coming down, farm income started coming down, and so what we were looking at was about 6 years of declining or low farm income and continuously rising or high property taxes. And the farm lobby, farmers themselves made their legislature aware of this coming problem, and the legislature stepped in and changed the formula. So now the decline that was inevitable anyway after 2021, now the decline is happening now, brought the decline forward in time. All right, now let's take a look at how this calculation is done. And what I want to show you here is the calculation of the base rate that was made by the DLGF for this tax year, for taxes payable here in 2017. So it's assessment year 2017, tax year 2018. We call that 2017 pay 2018. The taxes on property that you pay this year were based on the assessment that was done last year, just like your income taxes this year are based on your income from last year. And here's how it works. We take 6 years worth of data, and we take the most recent data available. So the assessment year 2017, data from 2016 was the most recent available. So we take 6 years, 2011 to 2016, and we take 2 measures of income. And so this is the amount of income that one can earn from growing and selling corn and soybeans from an acre of farmland. And it's measured in 2 ways. It's measured by looking at average cash rent across the state for an average acre. This is done, these numbers come from a survey that the Department of Agricultural Economics conducts every year. And then we do a calculation of operating income. And operating income comes from commodity price times the yield, the amount that's grown, minus the costs. And so we take the net revenue from raising corn and beans and selling them, less the costs, and that gives us an operating number right here. And then we calculate it, or figure out a capitalization rate. And that's just an interest rate that is a farm-related interest rate. It comes from the Chicago Federal Reserve. It's just based on an interest rate that farmers use to borrow money for their operations. And what you do is, this is a capitalization formula, so you take the measures of income, you divide it by the interest rate, and you get what a reasonable buyer would be willing to pay for an asset. So if you want this rate of return, and you want to earn $254, you'd be willing to pay $4,528. So this divided by that equals these 2 right here. We then average those 2 together, right here, and then we look at all 6 of those numbers, and we drop the highest one, and we average the other 5 together, and it came up with 2,940. So that's the calculation. Now, in the old days, we would have finished right there. It would have been 2,940. But now, as you'll see, this is just the preliminary number. Now there's a second step that was introduced in the legislature, by the legislature a couple of years ago, and now is an important part of this calculation. So again, what we're doing is taking income earned divided by the capitalization rate equals market value in use, as it's called, average together, drop the highest, take the remaining 5, average those together. Preliminary base rate. Now, we look and say, well, what was the existing base rate? The base rate coming out for taxes payable in 2017 was $1,960 per acre. That's $29.40. That would be 50% higher. If we went with $29.40, it would have been a 50% increase in the base rate of farmland. Would have been a very large increase in assessed values, a very large increase in tax payments by the farmer. And so we take this next step, and here it is. We look at this comparison, right? It would have been a 50% increase, and we say, all right, we're now going to mess with the capitalization rate. Right? See these numbers here, 5.6 to 4.8, relatively low rates because interest rates everywhere are relatively low. And we say, all right, if the preliminary base rate is 10% or more above the existing base rate, use 8%. That is, if we're in the situation that we're actually in, and this change in the base rate from 1960 to 2940 would be more than 10%, which it is, we're going to replace all these capitalization rates with 8. Now, if you take this income number and divide it by 8, instead of numbers like 4 or 5, of course, we're going to get smaller numbers over here. And so that's what we do. Now, if in the unlikely situation that the preliminary base rate is between plus or minus 10% of the existing rate, we'd use 7. And if the preliminary rate was 10% or more below the existing rate, we'd use 6. I can tell you right now, we have forecasts, made reasonable forecasts, and even unreasonable forecasts. 10 years into the future, there's absolutely no way we're going to use anything other than 8 over the next decade. So it's going to be 8, which is nice in terms of projections because it takes the whole interest rate calculation out of the picture. So what are we doing? We're using the cap rate to make sure the base rate doesn't increase or decrease too much. We use 8%. So what does it look like when we use 8%? Here's what it looks like. There's my 8 right there. Same numbers over here, now divided by 8, produces much lower numbers over here. We still drop the highest number, which is 2013. We take the average of the remaining 5, and it turned out to be 1850, or a 5.6% decline from the 1960 of the year before. Now, the DLGF has just announced, about 3 weeks ago, announced what it was going to be for this next year. And here it is. Okay. Still 8%, that's the cap rate. But we take the net incomes, they got 175 and 26 over here. They revised this number to 75, and that made a different number over here. But look what we've got in 2017. Cash grunt, about the same as it was before, operating even lower than it was before. So a number right here, 1,256. Now how does that change the average? Well, if you look back over here, 2011 was the first year, right? Because it was for 2018's taxes. And we had 2594 over here. We move forward 1 year, that number drops out, we add in the 2017 number. So we're dropping the 2594, which was made back when corn and bean prices were high, and we're adding in a number where corn and bean prices, like corn about 4, bean was about 10, 1256. So we're dropping a 2,500, we're adding in a 1,250, average those together, we get 1,610. $1,610 per acre is what the assessed value of farmland is going to be for taxes payable in 2019. So the assessor right now is starting to, I assume right now is starting to program the machine with 1,610 in it instead of 1,860. That's a 13.5% decline in the assessed value of farmland, in the base rate of farmland. And it's the biggest decline we are likely to see. And the reason we can say that is because we're looking to see what other numbers are eventually going to be dropped out. Suppose that we continue to bring in numbers that look like this one, 1444, or look like this one, 1256. Right? What are we going to drop out? We're going to drop out 1881 and add in a number like 1250. That one is never in the calculation anyway, so we'll drop out next to 2350, add in another 1250. Then we drop out a 994, add in a 1250. So we got a couple more years of decline, that's pretty clear. But the decline we just saw, the one we're going to see, I should say, next year, likely to be the biggest decline that we're going to see. Nonetheless, base rate is going to go down for a couple more years after 2020, next year. Projections for the future. Okay, so there's 1610. Let's actually do this thing. There's 1610. My co-author and I, Tamara Ogle, and I took the best farm price and yield and rent projections we could find and ran them through the formula in order to try to figure out what would happen to the base rate of farmland. And here's what we came up with. Right? We said, what's going to drop out? Up there. 1881 is going to drop out for the year 2020. What are we going to add in? Probably a number something like 1375. So we drop out a high number, we add in a lower number. Looks like for tax year 2020, we're going to get a number somewhere in the neighborhood of 1510, another $100 decline. That's a decline of, what, about 7% altogether, 6%, down to 1510. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 1500 is probably where we'll be in 2020. So looking forward again, another decline. And beyond that, here's what it looks like. So here's the preliminary base rate calculation. And here is the final base rate calculation. So there's the 1960, there's the 1850 for the year we're in right now, 1610 that's actually been officially announced. Our estimate of 1510, down here to about 1250, down here to about 1200, and then kind of stabilizing in the neighborhood of 1200 in 2022 and after. So we think we've got 3 more years, the one that's assured now, in 2019, and then 2020 and 2021, further declines in the base rate of farmland down to a number like $1,200. And you know, how good are these projections? This is where I get to, what can I say? Brag. 1 year ago, I wrote a column, my Capital Commons column, where I said, for 2019, the base rate of farmland is going to be something like $1,600, and it came out $1,610. So when I say it's going to be about $1,500, probably somewhere between $1,450 and $1,550 is where we'll wind up. But one thing we know for sure, down is the direction that we're going to move. So there's going to be further declines in the base rate. How far are we going? Well, if you take our 1850 and go down to 1200, that's altogether about a 35% decline in the base rate of farmland, in the assessed value of farmland. So 13% next year, 35% over the next 3, 4, or 5 years. All right, what does that imply for the circuit breaker tax caps? And I like to call them circuit breaker tax caps. I had an experience a couple of years ago. I did the International Association of Assessing Officers held its meetings in Indianapolis, and they had me do a talk about this, about farmland assessment. And so I'd done my talk on farmland assessment. Here comes one of the international assessors, I guess it was American, he came up, and oh, he's mad. And he's coming up to the microphone, and he's mad. He says, you know those things you call circuit breakers aren't really circuit breakers, right? And I said, I know. They put it in the law before we even noticed, and by the time we said, you know what's our circuit breakers? It was already in the lingo, it was already in the language, it was too late. So I like to call them tax caps, but these are the circuit breakers. The reason they're not circuit breakers, everywhere else in the country, what a circuit breaker is a comparison of your property taxes to your income, not to your assessed value. So if your property taxes go up above a certain percentage of your income, then they will rebate that difference. So it's a way of keeping property taxes affordable given what your income is. And that's what circuit breakers mean to everybody else. Not to us, though. We're going to call circuit breakers the circuit breaker tax caps. And first thing you need to know is agriculture is really important in the tax base in Carroll County. Here's a pie chart. This agriculture number includes everything, farmland and buildings and houses that farmers own. These are all of the parcels in the county that are identified with an agricultural number, even though some of those will have homes and buildings and other things on there. So this is farmland is about 400 million of the total, which is about 1/3 of the entire net assessed value pie. So this is after deductions. So 45% agriculture, about 33% farmland, residential single family about 32%, other residential, which is rentals and second homes, 8%, and then business, real, and personal, 15%. So Carroll County is one of the dozen or so counties most reliant on property taxes on farmland. So this is a county that is going to be affected by this decline in farmland assessments. Here's a map actually that shows you where the others are, and what I did here was to say a 39% reduction starting from the 1960s. So I made this chart a year ago, but the colors still matter. What I did was take a look at farmland as a share of each county's assessed value, and then said, okay, if assessed value goes down, how much does the tax rate have to go up on average in order to continue to raise the same levy? And the answer for these dozen counties here, including Carroll, was 15% or more. I'll have actual estimates for you here in just a bit. So Carroll County, one of 12 counties most likely to be affected by this decline in assessed value. Why does this matter? Well, okay, so what happens? Assessed value goes down. You try to raise, if the county, if the cities and towns, the corporations, everybody still tries to raise the same amount of revenue. The levy stays the same. The maximum levy keeps going up, as a matter of fact. And most places tax right at their maximum levy. So assessed value goes down, the levy stays the same as it would be. In order to raise that levy with a lower assessed value, the tax rates have to go up. And we recalculate the tax rates every year to make that happen. But as tax rates go up, more and more taxpayers hit their property tax caps. Now the property tax caps, as you can see up there, are 1% for homesteads. What that means is that you're a homeowner cannot pay more than 1% of the gross assessed value of their property in property taxes. So if the assessor puts a value of $100,000 on your house, before deductions, the maximum property tax bill you can pay is $1,000. Likewise, residential and farmland, it's 2%. So if you've got an acre worth $2,000, you can't pay more than $40 on it. And then business, real, and personal at 3%. And so what happens is, as tax rates go up, first you've got, first, because of the deductions, first you've got the rental housing, as the tax rate moves above $2, if it's $1, or excuse me, if it's $2 or less, hardly anybody's going to be affected by that. Hardly anybody will be at a cap when your property tax rate is $2 per $100 assessed value or lower. Once you hit $2, then there are houses that will begin to be eligible, and most of your rental property will be eligible as well. And then if you get over $3, well, then the business property ends up being eligible. They get their caps as well, and by eligible I mean they get property tax cap credits to bring their property tax bill down to their cap. And so that credit, here's the tax rate times your assessed value, gives you a tax bill higher than your cap. They give you a credit for the difference. But what that credit represents is money that the local government has levied, the property tax levy, but is not going to be collected. And so that's a tax break for taxpayers, but a revenue loss for local governments. And as tax rates go up, revenue losses increase. Now statewide, it's about 10.7%. It's much lower than that in Carroll County. Whether you're in a city or town or not in a city or town makes a huge difference, because after all, tax rates are higher for taxpayers when you're located in a city or town. The tax rate the taxpayers pay is the county rate, plus the township rate, plus the city or town rate, plus the school rate, plus the library rate, plus the special district rate. That sum totals what a taxpayer pays, depending on where their property is located. But if there's no city, if they're outside a city, that tax rate will be lower. So if you're in the city, the tax rate you pay is higher. And if you're in the city, and if your local government overlaps a city, it means that the taxpayers you are taxing are paying that extra city rate, their taxes are higher, and any tax cap losses, any tax cap credits that are given to those taxpayers to hold their property taxes down, they get divvied up. Those losses are divvied up among the overlapping units. So just because you're in a city, if your property or your jurisdiction overlaps a city, it's not just the city that's going to lose revenue. Any jurisdiction that overlaps the city will have taxpayers at their caps, and they will share in the losses of revenue. So as the tax rates go up, then taxpayers hit their caps, get tax breaks, and local governments lose revenue. All right, so which local governments lose revenue? So here's a rundown of what I just tried to say, but I'm going to try to say it again. Which local governments will lose revenue due to the farmland assessment value? So what happens? If farmland is a large share of net assessed value in the county, which it is in Carroll County, then property tax rates will rise more. Bigger increase in property tax rates as assessed value goes down, and every unit tries to raise the same amount of property taxes. This shifts taxes to non-farm taxpayers, because after all, your tax rate has gone up. If you own farm ground, your assessment has gone down, and it's gone down enough so that on net you get a tax cut. But everybody else's assessment has not gone down, is now paying a higher rate. So taxes shift from farm ground owners to everybody else. But as those taxes shift through higher property tax rates, some of those other taxpayers, homeowners and businesses, hit their caps and don't pay that extra property tax, and that's lost revenue. This would happen, so unless taxpayers are at or near their tax caps, which would happen if the property tax rates are high, above $2, rentals become eligible for tax cuts, especially if above $3 when homeowners and businesses, lots of homeowners become eligible and businesses do too. So here it is, counties with the largest revenue losses are those with a high share of farmland and net assessed value, and within these counties, the units that overlap cities and towns are likely to have the largest revenue losses. So that's what we're looking at. That's why this happens. Now let's take a look at the estimated impact on Carroll County taxpayers. Sorry, what did I do here? Actually, I was glad to get this request because there's been something I've been wanting an excuse to try, and so I did. There's a gateway system, which many of you are familiar with from the other end, not the consumer end, but the producer end. And I'll bet it's a pain in the neck, is what I'll bet. But what it is the state of Indiana posting on the web a tremendous collection of data about local government. And most recently I noticed, and maybe it's been up there for a while, but I just stumbled on it a few months ago, they have put on there not just levies and assessed values and that sort of thing, but a record of every taxpayer's assessment and tax bill for every county in Indiana. That's about 3 million altogether. So what I did was to pull the data, download the data,